This is another really short chapter but makes some good points. In general, we are dealing with the commons, and obviously everything I am doing is in the context of climate change, which is the global commons like the atmosphere, ocean, and even land, because what we do is affecting everybody everywhere, on land, in the ocean, in the air, and so on. So this is about how the governance of such problems, such commons, requires multi-level governance, or polycentric governance as it is called more recently. You are all intuitively familiar exactly what that means, because every issue actually has multi-level governance. Governments of a country have federal government, it's democracy, let's say, some kind of a central government, state governments, then you have local governments, even down to a village level. You have housing societies managing their own affairs to a large extent within the rules of the town or city they are living in, and so on. So multi-level governance is pretty much what is a model that's used by everybody, including at a family level in many ways. So in this context, we will look at some points that we have already kind of addressed, but it's the idea of thinking globally and acting locally, especially when it comes to climate change. Greenhouse gas emissions have happened over time, and there was controversy about who's responsible for it, and it still goes on, but some negotiations have been going on to agree that maybe we use the 1990 baseline to assign kind of a proportional responsibilities to all the big emitters and the rest of them who are being affected by climate change, even though they were not major contributors historically. The context, of course, is that it is the accumulated carbon that decides global warming, in the sense that CO2 especially is a long-living, well-mixed gas that once you emit, it's going to stick around in the atmosphere for centuries. So accumulation matters, and who has been emitting since Industrial Revolution also matters in that sense. So the key concepts we will learn here are that solutions to many problems involve multiple levels of governance. So we will see how the levels drop from global to maybe a local. Become familiar with the concepts of polycentricity and polycentric governance. So the chapter title is Think Globally, Act Locally. So that's a question mark there. In the context of climate change, mitigation is a global problem because you reduce greenhouse gases, draw down carbon or reduce emissions, and use various approaches like switching to renewables, phasing out fossil fuels, electric vehicles, etc. Everything is about reducing global emissions, but adaptations, which are the responses to changes that are already happening and preparing for the risks that are expected to arrive at your door in the coming years and decades, are all local, in the sense they're very location specific climate change and climate change impacts. So in that sense, we need to think globally and act locally. So let's look at the global treaties addressing climate change immediately in this context now. As we write this text, delegates from all over the world are coming together for an important conference on climate change in Paris, France, to attempt to reach an agreement on emissions reductions. This was 2015. The famous Paris Agreement that was hashed out was very different than the previous agreement made at Kyoto in 1992 or so, called the Kyoto Protocol, which was more of a top-down agreement, and basically it failed. Now there is more of a bottom-up effort to redo this, and it's stumbling along, as we will see. This will likely be the last chance to sign such an agreement to avoid dangerous climate change. Such words are kind of not entirely scientific, but they are used repeatedly as what is dangerous climate change? I don't think anybody has defined it. We could have written these same sentences at several points in the previous 2 decades. Every few years there is a critical conference on climate change, and every time thus far the agreements made are limited and They do not result in actual changes that bring about emissions reductions. I'll show a figure in a minute for that. So obviously every year there is now a conference of parties, and we had just COP28 in Dubai, or yeah, I think in Dubai, fossil fuel region, which was fighting hard to say that they are serious about climate change as well. Climate change is a very challenging problem, since we cannot exclude anyone from using the atmosphere to dump their carbon waste. We all do it every time we take a car, bus or plane ride, or even everything you buy, eat, drink is got a carbon footprint. Nor can any individual or group really shield themselves from the consequences of climate change. Thus, solutions will require that a large number of people change their behavior at a cost to themselves for the benefit of everyone, which was our classic social dilemma. So you have to reduce your carbon footprint and somewhat degrade your life standard, maybe not quality of life, but nonetheless, and you are doing this for the global betterment and for future generations. Moreover, the benefits will only be experienced decades later by future generations if we cannot resolve or solve the climate change problem through negotiations at the international level. At which level of organization might we attempt to address the problem? So this is where multi-level governance makes sense. It's been playing out that way, but then you can see that there are many smaller and smaller scale governance efforts being made to tackle the same problem in different contexts, in the context of cities and resilience building, mitigation, adaptation, and so on. So this battle continues. So in this context, in this book, we have mainly discussed examples of local and regional commons. We have seen that communities can be successful in governing their shared resources. One of the key problems of governance of resources shared in common is the problem of scale. Right? It's one thing to manage a little pasture or a little lake, let's say, for irrigation, versus a river system that crosses many boundaries, or the atmosphere which occupies the whole globe, oceans which cover so much of our planet, and so on. If one looks at resources beyond the community level, the number of actors involved starts to grow substantially in many cases, and many of those actors have overlapping responsibilities and authorities. For example, the Colorado River passes through 5 states in the US and 2 states in Mexico. Actions of upstream states affect the downstream states. At the time of writing this book, the southwestern region of the US had been experiencing a drought for many years, and this led to tensions over water availability for different states. As we discussed in Chapter 5, the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled on the allocation of Colorado River water, but that allocation was based on a period of higher than average water supply and much lower population densities. So climate change and natural variabilities together have reduced the rainfalls, or made them more extreme, changing the hydrological dynamics of how groundwater gets recharged and how much water remains in the rivers and soils, and how much gets run off into the oceans, and so on and so forth. And populations have grown in the meantime, and we discussed this before about Arizona, and much of the western US is dry by nature, by climatology, and yet the attraction to stay in these regions is very high, and population densities are obviously beyond sustainable in terms of water use, for example. What will happen when Lake Mead dries up and no water is allocated to Arizona? Will upstream states be requested or required to reduce their water use, and who will enforce such restriction? So those are the issues. Just to place ourselves in context, these I took from Wikipedia. This is from USGS, I think, which is public. It's an open domain. So you can see the Colorado River, which runs from Colorado, of course, has many tributaries that join along the way, goes through these states here in the US before crossing the border into Mexico and running into Baja California. So if upstream users have all the rights on the water, then obviously downstream users begin to pay a price, and in fact Mexico has consistently paid a price over time because of the agreements. And can US really make all the agreements it wants without worrying about what is the share of Mexico, which is another country, and the river crosses not only state borders but also the international border. So the climate change here, annual flow volume in millions of acre feet. You can see that this was early 20th century drought that flattened the flow and reduced it a little bit. Then you had the 1930s drought, which created the Dust Bowl years, which was a disaster for the US and led to the Deep Depression and the so-called Great Depression. Mid-century drought happened again, and it continues to decline into early 21st century drought. So these are various data sets used here, and there are also different sources. So Lee's Ferry volumes, Lake Powell inflows, and forecasted inflows for 2004. So this figure is a bit old, but the trend continues. Lake Powell has almost dried up. Lake Powell is an artificial reservoir created, and so on. So this exemplifies a real large-scale common water resource that is being used by so many stakeholders, and so many governance entities are involved at local, state, and international levels, that it's a nightmare in terms of doing institutional analysis and coming up with design principles for sustaining this common. There are others where the boundaries here, at least the boundaries are well defined in terms of the watershed and the states and countries involved, but you have things like fisheries, where once you're in the open ocean beyond the so-called exclusive economic zones of 200 nautical miles, which was arbitrarily brought up by the US in the 1800s, I think, and is now adopted by all countries. And it's not very easy to demarcate a 200 nautical mile, and not easy to enforce, but some are much more aggressive and capable of enforcing such a limit, versus other countries like small island states. If a big ship comes along and starts fishing in their waters, what are they going to do? Where will they go for seeking justice? And if sea level rises and their land sinks, then what happens to the 200 nautical mile, and so on. So many very complicated issues arise based on the scale. So if you look at the fisheries from 1974 onwards, this is an FAO report that I cite here. There are many that have become overfished, so they are in the unsustainable range, and there are maximally sustainably fished species globally. This is a global mean. They are still considered sustainable, but you can see the percentages dropping over time, but you have to be careful. Underfished have completely dropped off here to in terms of the percentage, which means pretty much everything is either maximally sustainably fished or overfished. So you can see that the amount of overfished, percentage of overfished fisheries around the globe have increased steadily, with some variability along the way. Okay, so this is for 2019 from the same FAO report, which looks at stock status as sustainable and unsustainable for different regions. So Pacific sector here, Atlantic South and North, and the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. And you can see that there are some that are very highly sustainable at about 86% here in the Gulf of Alaska region, and many are in the unsustainable range as well. Okay, so this is getting a bit long, but I'll come back and continue this discussion in the next podcast in terms of how to think about our institutional analysis and development framework for these large-scale commons, which require multi-level governance. And then we have to learn about polycentric governance and what the design principles there are, and what does it even mean, and what are the various examples of polycentric governance entities. And of course we'll come back to climate change, the biggest example of something that requires now polycentric governance and how it's playing out. Okay.